Hi, my name is Jo Perrott and I'm the founder of the Ladies Working Dog Group. I hope you really enjoy our first podcast where our group experts get together and chat through what is needed when we talk all about commands. I'd like you to get to know some of our group experts.
Hi, I'm Sam Thorneycroft-Taylor of Languedoc Gun Dogs in Gloucestershire.
Hi, I'm Claire Denyer from Family Dog Services based in Maidstone in Kent.
Hi, my name's Jemma Martin. I'm one half of Whistle and Wag Dog Training based in Suffolk.
Hi, I'm Emma. I run Cunning Shot Dog Training based in Leicestershire in the East Midlands.
Okay, ladies, I want to know more about cues and commands.
So for me, when you look at training a dog from a puppy, there's so much involved in it. You are teaching the dog by association, cues and commands and release words, and you're pairing all of that with actions and behaviours so that the dog, who obviously dogs don't speak English, but we use that technique to communicate with the dog.
When I first started out, I generally thought there was like the least commands you had, the better, right? And now I've found that I put more commands in. I would have used far less, and now I use more because I want to explain to the dog more what I wanted to do. But on the same way, I've lost commands as well. Like I used to say, sit, stay. I don't put stay in anymore because sit means sit, and until I tell you something else, don't do it. In our hot mess handler, we have sit, we have stay, recall. People say get out or go back or get on. Like where should we start? There isn't a manual of like what the command should be, is there?
I think it's because there doesn't necessarily need to be a manual of commands. You can use anything that you want as long as you're consistent with them. So as long as your sit is always this position that the dog presents to you and you've never then misrewarded a different position, that word association to that dog or that hand signal to that dog or that whistle command to that dog will be the position that you've heavily rewarded. The problem you have is then when you mistime your rewards and you reward in the wrong place or at the wrong time, that then you would have to maybe reteach with a different command verbally or with body language or with a whistle because the dog doesn't actually understand what you're asking of them.
And also what you find is when people get frustrated when they're training the dog, they tend to change their cues or their commands or get flustered with what they're saying, which can be even more confusing for the dog. So people will say sit, and that becomes I said sit. Sit there. And that's just one like really brief example of owner frustration, then creating real confusion for the dog with what the dog's being asked to do.
So I think a clear one of that is when people start saying sit down. And it's like, are you teaching your dog to sit or go down? And the dog just looks blank and doesn't do either. And the owner can't understand why.
Or they have get down, which is actually when they jump up at something, they say get down. And it's like, well, down to the dog means something different. So you actually want them to get down off the side and lie down, or do you just want them to get off the side, in which case you'd probably need a different cue. Also, what you have is when multiple families train the dog, you'll have them slightly using different words. And the biggest one I see is people saying, heel, please, or sit, please.
Yeah.
Again, those words, the additional word on the end of that can completely change the cue for that dog as well.
Do you know when you were saying now about like when you reward cues as well? I have found with Buddy, because I've heavily rewarded sitting in front of me to give me the dummy, I now, when we walk in, like heel work is getting great. I say to him, sit. He sort of like runs in front of me and sits. I'm like, sort of, because you are sitting, but like I would have liked you to sit where you were. So it is hard, isn't it? Because he's doing in his head what he thinks is the right thing, but it's in the wrong place at the wrong time. So you can see why people get like really, really confused on what I need, where do I start? Is it a case of you start off with one cue at a time and then add them?
I think it's actually also how kind of pedantic you are about it. Like for me, sit means sit wherever you are when I cue it or command it, regardless of what's going on, which eventually obviously becomes your emergency stop or your stop whistle as well, because eventually you transfer it over to that whistle, and that would mean sit wherever you are. It doesn't mean come in and sit in front of me because that's been heavily rewarded. And it doesn't mean spin out from heel and into a sit in front of me, because that's been heavily rewarded. So for me, that sit position, when asked for it, either by body language, food, or whistle, needs to be built up so it's wherever you ask for it at that time, they do it. So you're not only teaching it as this static position that's your, what I would call a recall position, so in front, you're then also rewarding that position as much if it's at distance, as much if it's at heel, and you have to practice that as a handler, that it means all of these places, it just means sit wherever you are.
Yeah.
But you also have to be clear with the body language that you put in. So if you've taught your young puppy to always sit in front of you and in that recall position, and then you're trying to get it to start sitting round by the side of you or away at distance, you can back it up with your body language or your arm up or another visual aid that makes it clear to the dog that I said sit, I mean sit over there, not where you've always done it thus far here. It's just an expansion of the command sit.
And then obviously we've got the fact that we're adding on, we've got voice commands or voice cues, and then we've got our whistle, and then we've got our hand. Like, I've got to be honest, sometimes I'm flustered on what I'm doing. I look like I'm having some sort of crazy rave on my own, because I'm like, where is my hand going? Am I whistling? You know, like sometimes when they're recalling, I'm blowing recall, and then I'll do a sit to the end, and I'm like, do I need to sit to the end because they're recalling? Shouldn't they automatically sit? You know, it is hard to know what goes where, when, isn't it?
I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, especially when I'm working with, let's say, a new puppy owner, a first-time dog owner especially, I'll sort of say to them, keep this as simple as you can for yourself. You know, you need to know what you're doing. If you can't know what you're doing, if you're getting confused with what you're doing, your dog's definitely going to get confused. So my kind of rule of thumb with most sort of beginner people will be, think about what your words are going to be, your verbal communication. Add the whistle in later when the dog already knows it with the verbal. But if you're, especially say if you're using a treat with a puppy to lure them or, you know, to show them. So I always explain to a puppy owner that your treat's like a diagram. They follow the treat in your hand like a little diagram. So think about the placement of the hand position with the treat. So when you're teaching the sit, think about how you're holding the treat. So you're already starting to get the puppy and yourself used to that hand signal.
What would happen is your whistle, you would teach that, let's say a sit, for example, your hand signal and the treat and the verbal, you would then start weaning off some of them to then replace it with the whistle as well. So your dog would have a very clear understanding that if you said sit with no body language, they would know exactly what you mean. So you isolate all of them completely. So you would, if you could verbally say sit with your hands behind your back and your dog sits, they clearly understand that verbal with no additional body language. If you put your hand up when you've already got eye contact from that dog and it sits down, it clearly understands the body language as an isolation, which then means that you can then add that whistle pairing to the body language, and your dog will understand then eventually that whistle, so that eventually if you put your hands behind your back again, you can blow a sit whistle and your dog will sit regardless of any body language. But then you have to be very, very clear and not miscommunicate with your body language, which is probably one of the most common things I think that owners do, is their commands will be fine, but their body language may change as well. So they'll say sit, but their hands will be open as a recall or something like that. And the dog's like really confused at that point because the body language that's being given and the words are two totally separate things.
So when you talk about isolation, that means just using one of, so hand or, verbal or whistle. If we practice and we know they know them all in isolation, that then gives us the confidence that we can rely on each one. Is that what we're saying?
Yes.
Once we've got a dog listening to commands and we're happy with whatever those commands are, whatever we wanted them to do, and we know that we might add some in and take some away depending on what the situation, as you go on further and you get more confident and you want to go onto the stage, nobody wants to hear you on the stage shouting, sit, stay, whatever. And nobody really wants you blowing the whistle like a crazy person. So where does it start going from like all those things to a more subtle use of just one?
That's where I would say like commands go from being commanded to an automatic behavior. So like Joe, you were saying when you recall your dog in, you're then asking for that sit in front of you. Eventually the dog will be so heavily rewarded over and over again, it turns into a behavior pattern and it's kind of a memory to them. And you've like trained their muscle memory. Easiest way to do it is to explain it is probably with a retrieve. Like if you add your recall whistle in once a dog's picked something up and is on its way back to you, you add your recall whistle in, eventually you can wean off that recall whistle because a dog will realize, right, every single time I've had something in my mouth, I go back to my owner and I go and find my owner and I'm rewarded for it. So you can then take off the recall whistle and your dog will still display the same behavior because it's almost muscle memory by that point. That time frame is totally individual to the individual dog and how consistent and good at handling you've been in the past as well, if you haven't ever kind of blurred any handling techniques or anything.
Okay, but that's what we're looking for, isn't it? In the end, is that we need minimal handling once that starts. Yeah,
for a scene retrieve for an experienced dog that's had the correct cues added in and then weaned off correctly at the right time, you would only really maybe not even necessarily line them out if they've marked it. You'd just say their name and whatever release command you've got, and then the rest of it should be complete silence because the dog should have the mark on it, run straight out to that retrieve, pick the retrieve up cleanly, bring it straight back to you, sit, deliver, and then even sometimes finish because that's the behavior pattern that's been taught to them over and over again, and it's now muscle memory.
I was going to say, and the thing is, they learn patterns of behaviours really quickly. So if you've got a really switched on dog, you have to almost be careful sometimes with what you're teaching them, don't you? Because they learn patterns of behaviour so quickly. So for me, I find with some dogs, I need to actually change routines quite regularly to stop them preempting. So there are certain things like Em was just describing with the retrieve where we want them to build that muscle memory and we want that to be the flow. And I described it to a client the other day saying the retrieve looks, a polished retrieve looks so beautiful. The dog runs out on one command on a marked retrieve, exactly as Em just described, picks the dummy, brings it back, delivers the hand, comes into heel to finish. And it just looks seamless, but you have to break that down. And I describe it as lots of little pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that we've trained through cues and commands and through luring and shaping. And then you put it all together and you've got this lovely puzzle, which looks like a beautiful picture, which is the retrieve. But on the other hand of it, you've got dogs will learn things that you don't necessarily want them to learn through patterns being repeated. So there's a double-edged sword to it.
When you said then luring and shaping, what are they?
Yeah, so when I'm working with puppies, personally, I use luring and shaping loads, especially with young puppies. I use a lot of luring. And that's, when I was saying about using the treat as a little diagram to lure the puppy into a position. And then I pair that action behaviour or position with a word or a hand signal. That's me using luring. With shaping, we're more getting the dog to figure it out. There's a lot more onus on the dog to work out what it is that we're asking for, but we then reward them when they get it right.
A really obvious shaping exercise would be if your dog came and sat by the side of you when you're cooking and you rewarded that very quickly. If you build that up over time, your dog would never jump up at the sides to get to the worktop because it's always been rewarded before the jumping bit happened. So if you're quick, you could shape really good manners by rewarding it before it turns into an attention-seeking naughty behaviour. The place boards are another really good one. If you reward over and over and over again in the same position where you go and put your feet up against that short edge, you lure your dog onto the place board and you treat that position over and over again. When you then get your dog off, if you go and stand in that same position, your dog will voluntarily offer that behaviour of sitting in front of you because it's become like a muscle memory to them of sitting in front of you and being rewarded.
Our place boards masterclass is probably one of the most watched. And I definitely think you hear the arguments all the time of, should I use this? Should I use this? Should I use this? If you're using this, you shouldn't need this, blah, blah, blah. I think they've all got a place in there, and you can use things we always say, teach the dog in front of you or train the dog in front of you. Place boards have got a place. They can come in and out, can't they?
Yeah, and the thing is as well is like you said that Buddy's now spinning into you when you sit him. If you heavily rewarded him sitting on the placeboard and you moving from in front to the side of him and rewarded that position and then paired that with heel, you would get that same position. So every time you'd stop, he wouldn't feel the need to move in because he's been rewarded at the side of you as well as in front.
I think the important thing is as well, like, and this is such a great topic for us to be talking about, but for me, unless I'm actually working with a dog, I'm not going to tell somebody what they should be doing or how they should be doing it unless I know that dog, I can see that dog and I'm working with that dog. Because for me, every dog is so unique, and what works for one dog won't necessarily work for another, whether that be a method or a tool like a placeboard or treats or whatever. But also knowing how much pressure that you can put on an individual dog as well. Some dogs work really well under pressure. Indy works brilliantly under pressure. The more you kind of add on for her, the better she works. Other dogs, if you put too much pressure on them too quickly, then they're going to back off and be a little bit overwhelmed. So I think it's really important to bear that in mind as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've had dogs actually scared of the placeboards to start with. So obviously something that's usually very kind of force-free and shaping and luring and by association becomes something that's actually quite terrifying for them because their feet, they don't understand how to put their feet and their body on different boards and things like that. So it has to be taught a lot slower.
Obviously, from the stuff that we've been discussing, we can talk about like working with cues in isolation, verbal cues, visual cues. Is it a case of a dog, obviously the speed of learning cues is different for everyone, isn't it?
Every dog is different, and we've got to bear in mind that the environment changes everything as well. So, you know, you could have a dog that happens to pick up on sit really, really quickly. But if you think back, actually, it turned out you were teaching it in your hallway and there was no distractions around them. Yet then when you tried to teach them to sit and hold a dummy, actually, it turns out that you were in a woodland with a load of rabbit and birds flying by. So there's a lot of environmental factors as well as your body language, the consistency and the timing of the command given and the rewards. I teach all of my dogs a release command, but over time and repetition and consistency, they all then learn that when they bring a bird back, I need them to keep hold of it. I don't want them to drop it, but I might not be in a position to get it straight away. And therefore, when I am ready, I put my hand out down towards them and they put it in my hand. And that it's still a command, but it's a visual command rather than a verbal command.
I think as well, once you've got your kind of what I would class as like your basic obedience commands, you actually then ask your dog to multitask. So like your sit becomes then a sit and wait for longer durations or longer distances and eventually turns into a stop whistle. Your hold command is actually a sit and hold. Your recall ends up actually being a recall with something in their mouth as a retrieve. So what we do is we kind of like stack on top of what they've already learned. So you might find a dog actually learns their basic quite easily and then we end up stacking on top of them and they learn everything then a little bit slower because we're asking much more of them in that position, if that makes sense. So like I say, your recall becomes a retrieve and a recall at the same time.
And not only are we asking the dog to multitask, but we're occasionally multitasking ourselves as well. So I will, if I'm working on for example, the end of a recall and I want it to, or I need to practice, or I want it to become a sit at the end of the recall, I know it's important that I praise the dog for coming back. I also know that in the beginning stages, if I'm introducing this as a behavior, then I need to use the sit command, and I can't say good dog and sit at the same time. So by teaching the sit separately with my visual aid of the flat palm of my hand as well, I can recall the dog, and as the dog is coming back to me, I can praise it verbally whilst visually putting the flat palm of my hand up and asking it to sit. So we're asking the dog to not only do multitasking, but also to understand our multitasking asks of it on top of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the line of multitasking there, a really common theme is a lot of clients, they're quite desperate to get that sitting delivery from the dog. You know, it looks beautiful. but they don't understand how actually technically tricky that can be for some dogs to get that multitasking together. So I'll always say, look, if your dog is delivering you to hand beautifully in a standing position, and this follows on exactly from what Sam was just saying, I'll get them to put the hand under the dummy. So that's the signal, the visual cue that the dog needs to release the dummy, but ask for the sit with the other hand or verbally. So the dog actually starts to multitask those two things together. This hand goes under to take the dummy whilst asking for the sit, and the two things combine more naturally until the dog has learnt that it can actually do that off of its own back, that it doesn't need to be given those both physical and verbal cues.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about like cues we can use, whether a cue or a command, how we can teach them in isolation, how there's like loads of stuff that we've already talked about. It's been a really jam-packed podcast. What happens though, let's just finish this conversation on what happens if you like really mess up a cue. You've not been consistent with it, you've made it mean something else by accident, and the dog's not responding. Once we've poisoned a cue, what should we do?
So poison cues can be for multiple reasons. It can be that you've maybe got a rescue dog and it's got some sort of negative association to it, or it could be that you've maybe either overused it or rewarded at the wrong time and things like that. So probably the most common one that I come across is heel, because an owner will say heel at the same time as the dog's lead is tight, which obviously doesn't mean that. So heel to me is a loose lead or off lead at my side, and it's a very structured position. I don't want their shoulders any further than my leg, basically. So that for me is where their target position is, and that's what I would teach. If the dog doesn't understand that and heel's been paired with a dog pulling in front or being behind or being out too far away from you, or with this lead tight, what I would probably do is I'd probably assess whether I think that there's some sort of recovery with the same word, or completely change it to a new command. So often I change heel to close, with quite a lot of people that have done it by accident, or maybe walk their dogs on harnesses that have then been really, really far out in front of them. So we then teach it completely separately again. So you almost go right from the ground up, teaching it as like a static position, heavily rewarded with that new word association, as if they basically don't know that command at all or that position at all, and make sure that that person, then the handler, is very, very consistent with when it's obviously praised and how it's praised as well.
That's absolutely fascinating me now. So I haven't even thought about this at all. So they pull in, you're going heel, heel, heel. They then, as the next time you go out, stand by the side of you, you go heel. Does that dog then think heel means pull me down the street?
Heel to that dog would then mean tension on my neck or on my body in any way, depending on what obviously item you're using. It would mean that is what that word means to them. So you would say heel and the dog would go, right, I need pressure. So it would go to pressure.
That's completely like, every time we have these conversations, something blows me away. That's like massively blown me away, because I hadn't really thought about that, because then they go back into pulling and then we're like heel, heel, heel. And the dog's like, am I not heeling?
That very commonly in heel work, a dog will get out in front and the owner will pull the dog back while saying heel, but it's not been clear to the dog at what point heel was. Was it when I was out there? Was it when I was next to you? Or was it when I was halfway in the middle? Which is why you need to be really consistent with not only the command or the cue that you give, but also the timing and the position and everything as well.
I think as well, what also people do, and I see this an awful lot, is they'll wait for their dog to be in front. They'll then check the lead or get them to come back to them saying heel at the same time, followed by good girl or good boy. So they've not only given the command, they've also praised it before the dog's actually back in the correct position again. So they've given the cue at the wrong time and the praise at the wrong time, and therefore created a learned behavior that heel and praise means tight lead out in front of my owner or being pulled back towards my owner, neither of which are obviously what you want.
Okay, so that's our podcast on cues and commands sort of wrapped up. Loads more to see in the Hot Mess Handler, loads more to see in our master classes. Anybody want to say anything to wrap us up from this lovely podcast? Claire?
Yeah, definitely. I think really the takeaway from this is remember that your dogs don't speak English. Remember that 80% of dogs' body language is non-vocal. Dogs are good at communicating without vocalizing. And remember that they read your body language, your hand signals, your facial expressions, even your gaze, you know, where you're looking. And it's really super cool. So just bear that in mind.
Lovely. Thank you, ladies. And that's this podcast done for this week. We look forward to speaking to you all and for our listeners to listen in next week.